Hi everybody, and congratulations on completing the first part of the course, our 12-lesson resource guide e-course on how to give your child a classical Christian education at home. And I know this was a very interesting, inspirational part of the course for you, and challenging, with those quizzes. I'm sure you were all challenged by these very difficult quizzes. But, that's what makes you tough. So we're going to get into the specific aspects of what is a classical Christian education now. I'm going to start out with what is called the Trivium. And our learning objective, is going to be to explain the biblical foundation of the methodology for education contained in the classical Trivium: grammar, logic, and rhetoric. Now, as you know, this course is about classical Christian education. And I should mention that I'm Dennis Oliver Woods, headmaster at Kingsway Classical Academy, the world's first online classical Christian school for grades 7 through 12. Well, as you know by now, this is a course about classical Christian education. And the question arises, what is it that makes classical Christian education so much better than what's being served up at your local government school? So if you're thinking about homeschooling, or if you're a teacher of any kind, the thing that makes classical education so great is that it teaches kids how to teach themselves. And that, of course, means less work for you and more joy of learning for your children. But are you tired of constantly having to nag your children to study? Wouldn't it be exciting to see your kids waking up at 6 in the morning because they can't wait to start cracking the books? And you may be thinking, what kind of dream world is that? But it's been happening at my house fairly consistently. My daughter Catherine is so eager to learn, she's constantly nagging me for new topics to learn about. And it can be like that at your place as well. It's really as easy as 1, 2, 3. And it's all wrapped up in a word that you probably haven't heard about, but a word that was a household name for your great-grandparents. And that word is trivium. The word trivium means threefold way. It means number 1, grammar, number 2, dialectic, and number 3, rhetoric. 1, 2, 3. 3 kind of fancy words, but what do they actually mean? So to answer that question, let's stop for a minute and consider what actually happens when you learn something new. There's really only 3 basic steps that occur whenever you learn any new subject. And let's take driving a car, for example. And let's take your son, for example. He's sitting behind the wheel, and you're pointing out to him the various components of the operating system, of the dashboard. And you point down and you say, that down there is the gas pedal, and right next to it there is the clutch, and there's the brake, and this up here is the gear shift. And that's the grammar, the basic facts, the basic fundamental building blocks of what it takes to drive a car. So then he goes on to say, or he asks, what's a clutch? He's kind of overcome by curiosity. So you explain, well, whenever you go somewhere, you push on the clutch and then you move the gear shift into first gear, and otherwise you're going to grind the gears. Then you release the clutch and you push on the gas slowly at the same time in order to start the car. And he says, oh, I get it. He says, a flush of understanding kind of sweeps across his face. And this is the dialectic. It's how the facts tie together. It's understanding the facts, how they relate to one another as it relates to driving a car. But he doesn't really understand yet, does he? And he won't really understand until he tries it for himself and becomes practiced and accomplished at driving the car. So you move on to the next step with a hastily uttered prayer. You lurch away from the curb. You lurch again. But after an hour or so of practice, he starts to get the hang of it. He starts to become proficient in this art of driving a car. And he gets so excited, he naturally wants to explain this process to someone else. So he said, hey Mom, guess what I just did? And so this process of practice and sharing what you've learned is called rhetoric. And it follows naturally from the dialectic analysis of the facts. The rhetoric of driving a car is practice and then proclaiming what you've learned in terms of the act of driving a car. Now, on April Fool's Day of 2007, the Portland Oregonian newspaper reported results of an informal survey entitled, What Was Missing from Your Public School Education? 2 of the top 3 responses were, number 1, the ability to engage in critical thinking, and number 2, the ability to communicate effectively that which you've learned. Now, little did respondents know, even though the words were never mentioned, but they were yearning for the dialectic and rhetoric components of the classical trivium, which John Dewey had purged from the system over 100 years before. So let's take a closer look at these two key ingredients of the trivium, of the learning process, the dialectic and the rhetoric. And we're going to postpone for a few lessons a study of grammar. We'll be coming back to that later. But in the 7th and 8th grades, they're known as the dialectic years because the student at this age is naturally curious. They're questioning, they're probing, they're challenging, a little bit cantankerous or challenging of authority. And so we seek to direct this natural scrappiness into productive channels by teaching them logic. And logic has two major divisions. One is formal logic and the other is informal logic. And in formal logic, the students are studying the syllogism, which is the form of argument, in which a conclusion is drawn from two propositions or premises. And a well-known example of the syllogism is all men are mortal, number one, the major premise. Number two, Socrates is a man, which is the minor premise. And in number three, therefore Socrates is mortal, which is the conclusion. And this is the formal syllogism, the form of which an argument must take in order for it to make any sense. Now, in informal logic, one of the things the students learn is how to recognize and counter the informal fallacy. And there's quite a few of these informal fallacies, maybe 15 or 20 are categorized. And you run into these informal fallacies all the time in newspapers, television, and so forth. And most people are getting hoodwinked by these fallacies because, number one, they can't recognize them, and number two, they lack the tools to defend themselves when it comes to these informal fallacies. Now, for example, one type of informal fallacy is the false alternative. And this fallacy offers a number of alternatives and then assumes that there are no other alternatives possible. And often the truth is among those excluded alternatives. So here's an example. Either you can accept evolutionary theory as modern science, or you can reject modern science and believe in special creation. And since you believe in special creation, you must therefore reject modern science. So you see how that works. Another type of informal fallacy is begging the question, or circular reasoning. That is, the premise assumes the conclusion. For example, the evolutionary geologist says we know the age of fossils by the rock layers in which they are found. But when asked how he knows the age of the rock layers, the answer is given, why, by the fossils I find in them, of course. So that's circular reasoning. Your kids won't be fooled by this kind of weak argumentation if they studied logic. More than likely, you'll hear them start talking back to Chris Matthews or Rachel Maddow and the other talking heads. And one of the most effective means of integrating knowledge and assuring understanding is the process of testing. We do this all the time informally in our lessons at Kingsway Classical Academy, providing tests for each of the topics studied. Here's a simple example. Let's go back now to our traditional 5-question quiz. True and false. Number one, trivium means threefold way. True or false? Number two, rhetoric is another way of saying logic. True or false? Number three, the syllogism is comprised of a series of logical fallacies. True or false? Number four, the false alternative is a violation of formal logic. Number five, application is associated with rhetoric. Okay, let's look at the answers here. First of all, trivium means threefold way, and that's obviously true. Number two, rhetoric is another way of saying logic. That's false. Logic is dialectic. Number three, the syllogism is comprised of a series of logical fallacies. And that's false because, the various premises can be very true, and that's what's deceiving because true premises can lead to false conclusions. Number four, false alternative is a violation of formal logic, and that's false. It's a violation of, it's one of the informal fallacies. Number five, application is associated with rhetoric, and that is true. Okay, so now in each of these lessons from here on out, I'm going to share with you a very effective resource or tool that you can use to help your child master each phase of the classical Christian education. So for more information about how to deal with the informal fallacies that you encounter regularly and the formal fallacies, or the formal logic, I highly recommend Peter Royce's Rhyme and Reason. Now, in this work, Mr. Royce provides the tools you need to counter the arguments you hear every day. You'll find exercises designed to help you and your children prepare for the logical fallacies you encounter, and many other aspects of logic also are covered in the book. Here's a quote from a student. Mr. Royce is a capable thinker and writer and a great guy, says Douglas Wilson. Actually, that's not a student. Wilson is the man behind the modern resurgence of the classical Christian education movement, founder of the Association of Classical and Christian Schools. And you can find this book in the bookstore at kingswayclassicalacademy.com. So that covers lesson number 5, the basic methodology of the classical Christian education, the classical and biblical trivium. And we're going to go on to looking at that in a little bit more depth next time. And we'll see you tomorrow, Lord willing.